chip on his shoulder. As Chris talked about so brilliantly in his show, Wally did not plan on continuing his career as a costume crime fighter past college, and he found himself forced back in as a member of the new Teen Titans as a result of Raven's manipulation. He managed to get out, hang up the costume as he discovered that he also had a disease which was killing him every time he accessed his speed powers. And while he was cured of this disease thanks to a blast of energy from the anti-monitor, he found himself taking up the mantle of his uncle, who died, much to Wally's shock. And so, coming out of Legends, we could see that Wally was somebody who resented the fact that there were people coming up to him on the street, asking him all sorts of what he felt were useless questions. He resented the fact that there were people who would make an honest mistake and refer to him as Kid Flash. For all Wally talked about honoring his uncle's legacy, Wally did something which readers could actually say disrespected Barry's legacy. And Wally decided to make his identity public. And not only that, but he also sought some form of remuneration for his services. I remember reading Flash #1 by Mike Baron and saying, he's actually asking for free health care? Like, Barry Allen would never do that. He'd have a job and he'd pay for his own health insurance. And the reason why I think Wally's revealing his true identity to the public was disrespectful to Barry was because Barry really cherished his secret identity. It was his way of being a costume crime fighter, but still being able to have a normal family life at the end of the day. Of course, he was married to Iris West, Alan, Wally's aunt, for a number of years. Barry was also interesting in that during the pre-crisis era, the grand majority of the superheroes had lost their parents, whether due to an accident or old age or some other tragedy. The exceptions were Wonder Woman, who could go home to Paradise Island periodically to see her mother and her fellow Amazons. And then there was Barry Allen, who at times could race home and see his parents, because in the pre-crisis era, Henry and Nora Allen were alive and well. The Reverse Flash had not meddled with time at this point. And Wally's just lucky that by revealing his identity to the public, he did not inadvertently reveal Barry Allen's true identity to the public. So Wally really had a sense that people were still comparing him to Barry or the old Flash, and that really hurt him. One example of this was in Justice League International #25, where Maxwell Lord was holding this big recruitment drive to expand the JLI, which eventually would break into its American and European branches. And at this party that Lord had organized, Hal Jordan said right in front of Wally that he missed the old Flash, the real Flash. And now, thanks to the Jeff Johns retcon, a reader can look at that and say, well, that was an early example of Parallax messing with Hal's mind and twisting his words. But this was still very hurtful for Wally, in that there were a number of stories which established that Wally viewed Hal as something of a second uncle. There was that real close friendship in the pre-crisis era between Hal Jordan and Barry Allen. And I know that a lot of people look at the iconic O'Neill Adams Green Lantern Green Arrow run and say, well, the Green Lantern Green Arrow partnership was a lot better, it was a lot more interesting, it made more sense. I would argue that while Oliver was a very important influence on Hal's growth as a costume crime fighter, Barry was the better friend. I felt that Barry added more stability to Hal's life. When he was around Barry, Hal didn't have to be such a randy fellow, especially around other women. And I think that Jeff Johns showed that quite nicely in Blackest Night. Wally would win the lottery, he'd become quite wealthy, he'd lose his fortune. At around the time of the return of Barry Allen, his economic situation had stabilized somewhat, and he had a really nice home. I don't think he had to hold down a 9-to-5 job at that point. Also, he'd be receiving a stipend as a member of the Justice League Europe. And he would get an updated costume in Flash number 50, the costume which most fans think of when they think of Wally as the Flash, the darker, more crimson-colored costume, shinier due to the materials that were being used, the stylized lightning bolt belt, the little wings being taken off the boots, and of course the white lenses being placed in the cowl. And the first two writers on Volume 2 of The Flash were Mike Baron and William Messner-Loebs, and they did a great job of showing Wally's journey towards rediscovering himself, becoming a better person, but there were a lot of times where it was 2 steps forwards and 1 step back, or sometimes 1 step forward and 2 steps back, as Wally would lose his powers. Something which really bothered Wally during this time was that he was not as fast as he used to be. He could only run at the speed of sound. And so he had to reteach himself how to deal with obstacles such as direct gunfire. Now he was a lot more vulnerable to things which, as Kid Flash, wouldn't have been that much of a concern for him. And so Baron and Messner-Loebs, and Giffen and DeMatteis to some extent as well, showed Wally as somebody who was becoming quite angry at points, flippant, certainly very immature. And a lot of that was attributed to finding that his power set had been decreased, finding that people were still comparing him to the former Flash, whether they knew his identity or not. But I would argue that there was something else that was responsible for Wally's social emotional development at this time. My apologies. At this point, I'm busy writing report cards, and so I'm coming up with all of these technical words. I'll try to cut back on them. I would say that at this point, even going back right to the end of Crisis on Infinite Earths, number 12, Wally was experiencing some pretty serious sense of survivor's guilt. The way in which he discovered that his uncle had died, he saw that the costume was empty, the ring was lying on the ground on the planet Cord, outside of a rambling psychopirate, it certainly appeared that Barry died alone, and there was no body to take back to Earth and to Barry. And I'm sure that hurt Wally so deeply that he could not describe his feelings in that way. And I mean, we see this in other stories, and we see this in real life, where somebody loses a person they love, and they respond by saying, "Why did they die? Why didn't I die with them?" Or in some cases, "It should have been me, not them." And I think that Wally was experiencing that as well. So that's just an overview of where Wally was leading into the return of Barry Allen's story arc. So let's get into it. And The Flash by Mark Waid, Book 2, actually begins with a crossover that started in an issue of Justice League Quarterly and then carried over into the pages of Flash Volume 2 and Green Lantern Volume 3. This story was co-written by Gerard Jones, the writer of Justice League Europe and Green Lantern. And in the afterword, Waid thanks Jones for lending Hal Jordan to the return of Barry Allen's story. And I think it is important that we see Hal Jordan in this story, given what I mentioned earlier about the historic friendship between Hal and Barry. And Waid does a really nice job of making use of the Hal Jordan character. So in this crossover, it begins with Hal coming back to Earth after having helped to rebuild the Green Lantern Corps. He's taken on the leadership of the Justice League Europe, and he's meeting with Wally as the Justice League Europe moves into its new headquarters. And we see right from the start that Hal has concerns about Wally's immaturity. This is evidenced by Wally using his speed to move heavy equipment, but also ogle Power Girl without her noticing. And at this point, over in Wally's title, he was beginning to see Linda Park, and he was starting to develop feelings for her. So the fact that he's also using his speed to give Power Girl the one-over a number of times without getting caught certainly doesn't make Wally look all that likable here. Now, Hal and Wally do have to step aside from helping with the move-in as Hector Hammond and Gorilla Grodd team up, and Hal and Wally have to go to Gorilla City to take on their two nemeses. And throughout the storyline, we see that Wally is aware that he has matured some since first becoming the Flash, but he's aware as well that he still has some more growing to do. And Hal expresses his concerns about Wally's immaturity right to Wally, but at the same time he feels that Wally is more capable than he thought, coming in as the new leader of the Justice League Europe. And so it's really interesting seeing Hal's perspective on Wally at this point, and then contrasting that with how Hal feels and what he says to Wally at the end of the return of Barry Allen. From there, we get a two-part story in Flash. I should say, at this point, the title was called Flash, not The Flash. And when the title would be renamed The Flash, there would be a very specific reason for that. And yes, this story arc does play into that slight renaming of the title. So in Flash number 71 and 72, we have a two-part story with the new Dr. Alchemy, who at points is also referred to as the Alchemist. There's a couple of reasons why I'm just going to mention the story in passing. First, it establishes the beginning of the Wally-Linda Park romantic relationship. And my goodness, I could